Hey everyone! Today we're completing the series on 3D modeling car and vehicle interiors. I've been covering vehicle modeling from beginning to end for over the past year. I have 10 parts for car exteriors, and this video is part 5 for modeling the interior. Today's final video focuses on how to complete your interior models, which includes the instrument panel, center stack and console, shifter, dials, door panels, open parts, roll cage, pedals, and the final stitching and seam details, and finally the UV mapping. This tutorial series is targeted for beginner to advanced skill level in 3D modeling. Maya 2023.2 will be used for this tutorial, but the workflows can be applied to any 3D software as well as any version of Maya. The best way to support my channel on YouTube is to like, comment, subscribe, and share my content to really anybody learning 3D art. I cover a wide array of different topics, so anybody learning 3D art can benefit. Another way to support me is to check out my ArtStation, where I have all of the samples, and you'll see that I have the Datsun 240Z nicely rendered here, and I also include it here right on my ArtStation store. So in order to get to that, you can just head to my ArtStation, head to store, and you'll see the Datsun 240Z, and you can pick it up for a quick 20 bucks, and that'll help support me create new content as we continue to move forward. So check that out. Alright, so here we are in Maya, and you can see, as always, I start with reference, right? That's going to be one of the, if not most important thing here. A lot of times we think we know what things look like, but you're always going to have good, solid reference from as many angles as possible. Thankfully, you can scour the web and build up your reference as much as possible. Now, the way I'm going to be handling is I'm going to be doing this voiceover over this sped up time lapse. So the final video capture was about 16 hours or so, maybe 20, but I have about 16 hours captured. And I found myself doing really the same thing over and over again, and it just made more sense to focus on explaining the workflows in practice here. So as you can see here for the instrument panel, I focused on building up a simple blockout, right? This is going back to all the way to part 1 where I started with that simple blockout. I took that blockout, refined it, added in this detail here for this kind of the speedometers, the tachometers, all of these dials, and I use simple cylinders for this, right? And this allows me to separate form from topology and edge flow, right? And it allows me to make sure that this is as accurate as I can get it compared to the reference. And since I have this nice simple blockout and this nice simple model that's focused on form, you can see I can focus on this edge flow and topology. Now this edge flow and topology, now that I'm adding it, isn't random. It is focused on the specific seams and separations in this model, and allows me to just add in this topology first and then focus on the rest of the geometry, right? Where it's just large surface areas. I talked about this in my modeling and topology tutorials as well, where these are always the first things that I focus on. And this instrument panel was the perfect example. Again, it allowed me to just separate that topology and edge flow, and I focus on that edge flow and topology for that detail throughout, and then I just continue modeling on that. So I'm going to let the rest of this play out for the instrument panel, and then I'm going to jump in when I start adding in these finer details. So talk soon. Now that we have the IP completely retopoed and edge flow situated, we can now worry about adding in that seam detail. Now that seam and separation, right, because this is composed of leather and suede and plastic and carbon fiber, I have all of that edge flow perfectly prepared. And I use the same exact technique that I use for the seat modeling, where I have my defined edge, I do an initial bevel of 0.5 with no fraction, and then I bevel again with 0.35. Again, I covered this in full detail in my last video on seat modeling. Now again, I'm applying these techniques to this object, which was perfect example of applying all of these techniques and workflow to a very, very complex, a very, very organic object. So I continue on and add these seam details here, and then I end up punching out the holes and separating out the panels for the vents and the glove compartment and then the dials as well. So I continue to refine and detail that. Once I have that, I'm going to jump over to the center stack. Now that I have the instrument panel all modeled, I can really focus on everything else, right? This allows me to duplicate and leverage the geometry from the existing piece, right? Because this instrument panel houses the center stack, houses the dials, the starter, buttons, and everything. So as long as my topology is clean, I can take, duplicate, separate, and use that geometry so it makes everything look like it fits in perfectly, just like the reference. So you'll see me duplicate these edges. I'll just edge copy and bridge, and then I'll clean up the geometry. I'm adding in my usual holding lines since we're doing more hard surface modeling here. And then I continue on and add in the detail. There's really nothing too crazy here for this center stack. It's a pretty simple shape, kind of this trapezoid type shape with some extrusions for the vent. And I do kind of this kind of separated sequential extrusion since there's different layers here. So now you'll see me extruding the bottom, again from the top, and then add in a little bit of a slant. So again, very simple workflow, and I'm just making sure that I'm always checking my reference as I go. Now the rest of the parts are going to happen in a bit quicker succession because the instrument panel was the most complex object. So things will start moving a little bit quicker from this point on. With the IP all set and the center stack done, I moved on to the vents here, which are very simple cylindrical shapes. And I always use these 16-sided segments, so that way I can remove every other edge and optimize it down to 8 if I wanted to create an even more optimized version. And you can see I'm just using the pipe primitives and simple cubes here. In this instance, I did not worry about combining these objects with perfect edge flow. These are smaller detailed objects, and really you gotta pick and choose your battles. I didn't want to spend a lot of time adding in more geometry, right? Because the detail that I put into this vehicle is a lot of detail. It's very high-end model, and it's got a lot of detail, and I can always optimize it even further. In this case, I just make sure to keep things pretty simple here and pretty modular and separate things out as you see here. So I do that and duplicate and rotate around this middle pivot and then just add in some holding lines. Once I have this piece done, it's smooth sailing as I move over to the dials. So I'm now moving on to the simple button that's on the vehicle. It's not a remote start, it's just kind of this button that sits on the dash on the instrument panel. So I modeled that in, added in some holding lines here for the center stack vent, and then now I go through and also add in this nice separation here for the vents to kind of get in that nice seam detail. Because I checked, when I looked at the reference again closely, it's pretty obvious that there's going to have to be some sort of seam there. So I ended up adding in this seam detail here for the vents before moving on to the dials. Now I'm taking a look at the reference again. As always, I always have it up on my second monitor, and I go through and I make sure that those extrusions that I did on the IP were all circularized in a perfect circular form. And so I can put in this simple cylinder here for the dials. And really, there's really nothing too crazy about this. I just use a 16-sided cylinder, got in the main form, and it has this layer for the texture. I opted to go just for textured speedometers and tachometers. I didn't want to do this via geometry since they're pretty small dials and they're pretty far, so we didn't need geometry. So I had the dials, and then I have the knob that goes in the dials and these pieces of geometry here. So I focus on creating the one piece and making sure that was exactly what I wanted and as close to the reference as possible. And then I went on and then duplicated that. Now you will notice that, I'm pretty sure I captured it, is that I unwrapped the dial before moving it everywhere else throughout the vehicle. That's because I just sometimes want to unwrap objects as I go instead of leaving it towards the end. Now remember, if you've watched my advanced UV mapping techniques, there's an easy way to have a script apply this and transfer UV attributes between objects, so it's not really that big of a deal. I'm just showing you different workflows as I make my way, and honestly it's just whatever I feel like at the moment, since I know I have a lot of modeling ahead of me, and if I got a lot of modeling ahead of me, I'm going to have a lot of UV mapping. And I make sure now to add this transparent cover here, and then some of the dials have these reset knobs and trip reset knobs, and I went ahead and duplicated that over, and here we go. I start to unwrap this object, and then I take this version once I have it unwrapped and everything's ready to go, and then I create and duplicate and move that throughout the rest of the vehicle. You'll notice that there's about 6 more dials that are really small on the center stack, and I end up making sure that the UVs are good, and as well as the pivots of the object that's turning the hand within the dial is all set up. So that way everything's essentially rigged here for me to do whatever I need. So now we're on to the center console of the vehicle. So I'm leveraging the blockout that I had. Remember, now that we're moving on to these newer objects, I'm going back and leveraging what was created for the blockout. So in this instance, it's pretty simple shape, very polygonal, very primitive. So I was able to just stick with having nice, simple, kind of cube-like proportions here. And it was very rectangular. So really there's not much craziness here. I did have to model this a couple times, which is kind of funny how that works, since this is one of the simpler objects. But I realized, because I modeled it symmetrically and then I looked at the reference again and realized it was pretty asymmetrical. One side had extrusions, the other sides didn't. So I ended up removing those details and adding in the asymmetrical details. So really that's the only caveat. You know, it's just making sure, double check your reference as I did, and thankfully I caught it and didn't lose too much time. So, but once I have that main form in, I just use simple offsets, simple extrusions, simple holding lines. There's really nothing too crazy about this aside from making sure that I caught this in time. So I'll let this one play out since it's a pretty simple shape, and then we'll move on to the next object. So now that I have the instrument panel and center stack and center console done, I'm going and modeling the gas pedals. There's going to be a gas pedal, a brake pedal, and a shifting pedal. So I looked at the reference, just modeled these very simple shapes right at the origin because I didn't want to model it at odd angles. And from there, I just do simple offsets and extrusions. And these have these ridges in here, and I of course did not want to worry about modeling that all as one continuous object. One could have, but it would have really overcomplicated the edge flow topology, spent a lot of time. So you'll see here, I'm just getting the right amount. One pedal had 4 ridges, the other one had 5. And normally if you look at it, you may not notice, but these are the little details I want to make sure I add in here. So I go in and add these ridges as separate objects to keep things nice and simple. And then there's this little bit of a taper, so I just move things down to match that taper. So this is the technique, the workflow that I use. There's 2 more pedals here. So I just modeled this and I did the same exact thing for the other 2 pedals. And then I add a little bit of a deformer. I add a little bit of a bend because you'll notice that they have this, nice bend in the reference to make sure that it really gives good friction with your feet as you're switching between pedals. So I'm gonna let this run out. As you can see, I'm applying that bend and putting it in position. And I did use the sweep modifier here, the sweep mesh for the pedals. So I just use simple curves to go up and into the center stack and the IP. You don't really see where it goes. Now, if you don't have sweep mesh, because this is Maya 20, it's a Maya 2022 or 22 feature, you can always just create the spline, the curve, and just extrude using a simple either NURB circle, or you can use a simple geometry cylinder. So it all works the same. It was just nice to only have to create the curve in order to create that shape. And here's the last pedal, so I'll let this run and I'll jump to the next object here. If you watched my previous videos, I actually modeled the steering wheel completely separate in another video. Now what I'm modeling here is the rest of the steering, which would be the steering column that attaches to the rest of what's underneath the vehicle, right? The entire steering system. So in this case, I had to make sure that I had enough of that geometry for the column to make it look believable. So it has the kind of the ignition portion, it has the blinkers, the turn signal, it has the as well as kind of this, it's not really a shifter, so one's a turn signal and one's for the wiper and rain and lights and whatnot. So I added all of that there, and here's the big steering column piece. So there's really nothing crazy here. I just use standard polygonal modeling techniques. I didn't have a blockout for this, so I did need to create a simple blockout. But again, I love that I captured this because it allows you to see me create this shape from beginning to end, where I start simple. I start with this blockout, I start with these simple bevels for the overall shape, and then I go in and start adding in that detail. And that's really what I'm hoping everyone kind of walks away from here is, you know, don't go through and model as much detail as humanly possible right out the beginning. It's this slow, iterative process of just adding more detail each pass that you go through. So you'll see that I create this column piece, and then I jump to the turn signal dials, wipers, and then I end up modeling like the keyhole. So very simple workflow, nothing again too crazy. It's just nice, simple poly modeling workflow. So I'll let this run and jump to the next object. now that we have the steering column all set up, we're now moving on to the door panels. So you can see this is based off of that nice simple block out that I created. And what I did, because the topology in Edgeflow was pretty simple, I opted to just clean this up a little bit instead of starting from scratch again. So I go through, I clean it up and start removing some edges, so I have a nice base to work with. I'm making sure that all of these pieces are nice sub-D models that I can subdivide later. And of course, if the topology is really clean, then I make sure that I can easily optimize this if I wanted to create a lightweight real-time game model. So I'm going through, now that I have this pretty much cleaned up with this nice edge flow, I'm cutting in the details for the leather panels, because the door panel is composed of leather and carbon fiber and sheet metal, and I have to make sure that that one edge that runs across the door panel as well as kind of loops around from underneath is all set up. And I use the same seam work process where I do multiple bevels to get this nice single top stitch in here, which is based off of the reference. And you'll see actually I did it and then I undid it and did it again because it wasn't quite right in the right position. So I just go through and do it again. So no big deal. And I'm able to double check reference as I go. Even after I did this, it was pretty close. So I'd say this vehicle was modeled with pretty good accuracy, with really as accurate as I could get. But of course, there's a couple of things towards the end I was like, oh, I guess if I could, I would try to fix it. But since this is a side project, I didn't have to really worry about that. So I'll let this run out and I'll let this finish. So now that we pretty much have almost all of the objects done, I'm now modeling the final pieces on the interior. which is the roll cage and kind of the sheet metal open parts on the inside. So I adjust and position the pedals. I'm looking at the reference again, referencing the positions of everything. And this is where I noticed I was off a little bit from how I created the interior as far as like the positioning of everything. It's just a little off, and again, I'm okay with that. For a side project, I can live with it. For a tutorial, it's understood, and I'm letting you guys know that there's a margin of error here. Now, if this was a actual, paid project, and if this was a project that I was working on with a client or somebody, I of course would make sure that it was probably fixed. But it's one of those things where it's understood from a learning standpoint. So you can see now I'm going through and just cleaning up. This part's pretty boring, I'll be honest. It's just a lot of vertex manipulation, a lot of extruding, a lot of cutting, and making sure it's quote watertight. Now don't take me verbatim, it's not really watertight, but what I mean is it's like sealed off. So there's no gaps, there's just natural seams without the vehicle. So I go through, I'm preparing all the open parts, putting in the rest of the holding lines, and get this vehicle ready for me to open and close the doors and make sure that everything holds up. So that's what I'm doing here. So not all that exciting. Actually, it was probably one of the most boring parts, which is why I put it off towards the end. But yeah, I'll let this run out. It's very important. With the interior open parts all set, I'm now moving on to the roll cage. If you remember, during the blockout phase, I just created these simple cylinders. These are 16-sided cylinders, and I use this technique where I did weld the majority of these pieces. I didn't weld that one that has like 1, 2, 3, 4, probably like 4 cylinders coming together. It's kind of in the back corner, and I weighed my options like, hey, the juice isn't worth the squeeze. It's not going to be worth the effort. I did weld it together with one piece, but here you'll see exactly how I did this. I used a nice simple extrude with a curve, and I make sure to use odd numbers of segments in case I want to remove them for optimization, and so, but it still holds the same profile. All right. After that, I go through and I start cutting in that detail and snapping some vertices. I covered this in one of my earlier videos on interior modeling, so you'll see that. And I actually have a whole video on modeling pipes. So once I finished the roll cage, I moved on to the shifter, and this one I actually really enjoyed because I didn't use a standard poly modeling workflow. Instead, you'll see that I subdivided the base mesh and I set these 2 constraints at the object, and wouldn't you know it, I used cloth simulation. Why? Because this is a very, very organic leather shifter boot. So I didn't want to worry about doing that through modeling. So instead I used soft body simulation. I did adjust the initial form. So this took me a couple of tries, iteration, to really get this kind of where I wanted. I kind of moved the leather in a way that I wanted it to kind of fall. So that worked well. And I constrained it. I used a pin constraint, a surface to point constraint on the bottom, a surface to point constraint on the top, and then I give it a little bit of a twist to really make sure that it looks nice and organic. And as you can see, it turned out really well. Maya also has a nice preset for rigid leather, so I was like, perfect. This is a very rigid leather shifter boot, and I used that to really get me about 90% of the way there. And as always, with cloth simulation, you get there just about the end, and then you give it that final 10% tweaking phase, where I ended up doing that with some sculpting tools. Once I've sculpted the details and I adjusted and moved it to really have that aesthetic look that I wanted, I went through and I applied my simple seam workflow where I just did an initial bevel. Now, shifter boots, because they're smaller pieces, have smaller seams, so I use smaller values here instead of the usual 0.5, 0.35. I ended up using like 0.2 and 0.1, so much smaller seams, and I ended up using a separate set of stitches. So I go through, I clean that up, and I apply the seams. So that was the full workflow here. It's really fun to do this one, so maybe I'll create like a separate video where I really showcase this workflow in the future. But let me know if you have any questions about it, and I'd be happy to answer. So as you can imagine, I started doing the seam work on the shifter boot, and I have the seams on the instrument panel, and I'm now moving on to adding the stitches. So I have an entire video focused on this where I do all the stitches. So this is really quick, but I end up using mesh with curves and a small stitch object. So make sure to take a look at my last video on how I did stitching. I cover it in detail there. That wraps up all of the modeling. Now I'm finally moving on to UVs. So there was one part on the IP that was just not unfolding. So what I ended up doing is I just skipped it. I unwrapped what I could. You'll see me kind of try a couple of things here and I'm like, what the heck is going on? I wasn't exactly sure why it just ended up like a coin, just cylinder shape, but I skipped it, moved on, and I said, hey, I got hundreds of other parts to unwrap. Let me move on to that. But as you can see, you guys, I have like so many videos on UV mapping. The techniques are techniques that I've just covered in the past. So be sure to watch my UV map anything in 5 minutes. Again, that's really what I used for unwrapping 90% of this vehicle. And for that final 10%, I used the advanced UV mapping techniques where it was the same techniques that I used for unwrapping the entire exterior. So very simple workflows. Here you can see me do it. You know, I posted some nice renders and UVs and checkerboards of this, and everyone just loved the UVs, and I'm like, it is very, very straightforward, right? And it's one of those things that takes a little bit of work. It's like rigging and skinning, right? It takes a lot of work, but once you get it done and it looks good, everyone loves it, right? So I go through and unwrap everything in this vehicle, and then I move on to packing, right? And the workflow that I used for packing was I made sure to combine all like objects onto the same UV layout, right? So here you can see I have all metal objects, all leather objects, all carbon fiber, all suede. All of them need to have the same grain and the same tiling. So I make sure to pack all of those that have very specific texture patterns onto the same UVs. So that's what I used here, and I packed everything and I applied representative materials, and this is me essentially wrapping up the entire modeling and UV mapping of this vehicle. Alright everyone, so that wraps up the final video. Honestly, this could have been another 5 parts alone, but I just found myself doing the same thing over and over and over again. And if you guys have watched my videos before, you know I'm all about learning workflows and not really watching me just do the same thing over and over and watching me manipulate and move edges and vertices. That's really not, you're not going to benefit from that. So hopefully you were able to watch this. Hopefully you were able to see all of the workflows that I always preach and show in action in this video. I did want to say a big thank you to everyone that's been following along, to everybody that's been sharing, liking, commenting. Really, that's all I ask. I mean, I've been a teacher for 10 years and I've been working in the industry for just as long. So I'm just trying to help out as many people as I possibly can. So make sure to spread this around, and I'm really, really looking forward to the next year. That's why I was so eager to just wrap this video up, wrap up this series, so I can focus on new workflows and new techniques and cover things that I haven't covered that can just benefit anybody learning 3D art. So with that, I'll stop yapping and I will see you guys in future videos. See you around.